Welcome to our final session of the New Testament Survey Part 2. This is session 5, and today we're going to be looking at the last letters in the New Testament that are associated with the Apostle John. My name is Stephen Clybourne, and I am the senior pastor of Earl Street Baptist Church in Greenville, South Carolina. And if you want to follow along, you can find our study guide on our website. We're going to be looking at pages 30 through 36. But since this is going to be the last time that I get to address you, I want to let you know, since this is the last session in the series, that this is the final session in a series that we have been through together as we've worked through both the Old and New Testaments. So if you want to go to our website, which is esbcgreenville.org, you can find all of the videos for all of the Old Testament and New Testament sessions. You can find the study guides by simply going to the website and then clicking on the resources tab, and then go to the Bible Survey Class tab. You can find all the past videos and all the study guides there. As I said, today we're going to be looking at the letters associated with John, sometimes referred to as the Johannine letters, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. The traditional view is that John, the son of Zebedee, the disciple whom Jesus loved, the beloved disciple as he is otherwise known, was the author. All of the Johannine literature is similar in language, similar in style, similar in themes, and similar in context. So it's pretty clear that all of this material belongs together. And you can see in, for example, in the Gospel of John, that the Gospel of John uses the pronouns I and we, but refers to the beloved disciple in the 3rd person. 1st John refers to himself, the author refers to himself as just I and we. In 2nd John, the author refers to himself as the elder. In 3rd John, he refers to himself as the elder. But in Revelation, he refers to himself as John. So the conclusion is that there may have been a number of individuals who actually contributed to the composition of the 5 Johannine writings over a period of time. But the authority of John the Apostle clearly lies behind the gospel which bears his name, at least in terms of traditions. Traditions say that 4th gospel was associated with the Apostle John, although its actual form probably came from someone else's hand, maybe John the Elder. But the issues that you have to kind of sort out in trying to figure out who wrote each of these writings are, first of all, the distinctions between the Apostle John, the elder, and the beloved disciple. Are they the same person or are they different people? Then internal evidence in the books themselves have to be sorted out. External evidence in which authorship is attributed to the apostle by tradition, and then the relationship with and among the other Johannine writings. So it's not just as simple as saying that John wrote it all, but certainly John, these writings are attributed to John. The consensus among New Testament scholars is that John was written somewhere between 85 and 95 AD. Though the book suggests a date, a lot of the textbooks suggest a date of 80 to 85. was probably during the reign of Domitian, the Roman emperor, who reigned from 81 to 96 AD. And a lot of the reason why that date is speculated is because of the highly developed Christology that the Gospel of John reflects. And what I mean by that is that by the end of the New Testament period, Jesus was considered to be not just a historical figure, but a pre-existent person, present with God in creation, as the Gospel of John says in the prologue. So, when the Synoptic Gospels were written, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is referred to as the Son of God. Jesus is referred to as Lord. But by the time you get to the fourth Gospel, as early as the opening section of the fourth Gospel, Jesus is referred to as God Himself, the Word made flesh. Tradition states that the Johannine letters were written near the last decade of the first century, First, Second, and Third John, probably from Ephesus, probably to the churches near and around the 7 churches of Asia Minor mentioned in Revelation, except for Third John, which was specifically addressed to Gaius. Second John is addressed to the elect lady and her children, probably a reference to a specific church, perhaps one of the churches of Asia Minor. And if this is the case, the recipients of the gospel were thoroughly immersed in this cultural movement of the late first century in that part of the world among diaspora Jews, such as Gnosticism and Stoicism, thoroughly immersed in the Greek thinking, Greek speaking, Greek philosophical worldview. And Gnostics were denying the real humanity of Jesus. Gnostics were basically saying Jesus could not be God and be really human. First John begins with an affirmation that Jesus was heard and seen and touched, probably to refute the Gnostic claims that Jesus only appeared to be human, that he was actually human enough to have been heard and seen and touched. In chapter 2, verses 18 through 25, the author stressed that God was really flesh and blood in Jesus Christ. There seems to be a real important emphasis on the real humanity of Jesus. And in First John, the writer makes the point that Christians show their relationship with God through love. Love is certainly the theme of First John. In the Johannine letters, love is not just a noun, it's a verb. It's not just something one has, it's something one does. It's not just an attribute, it is an action. It's connected to another Johannine theme, another loaded term in the Johannine literature, truth. Truth, too, is not just something one knows, it's something one does. And this theme is related to another Johannine theme, which is the verb believe. The word believe appears most often not in its noun form, which would be translated faith, but in its verb form in First John. So faith is not just a possession, it's not just something one has, it's something that one does. And all of these actions, love, truth, and belief, originate with God. We love because God first loved us. We love, John says, because God is love. And this is perhaps the greatest contribution to Christian theology that we find in First John. The claim that not only does God have love, not only does God show love, but God is love. And that is a distinctive claim that First John makes in chapter 4, verse 8. Second John repeats in briefer form the main teaching of First John. the emphasis again on love, and adds a warning against showing hospitality to false teachers. 3rd John was addressed to the unknown church of Gaius, to whom this letter was written. But in that church, a certain a man named Diotrephes, who, according to 3rd John, liked to put himself first, had challenged the spiritual authority of the elder, who was the author of this letter. Diotrephes had refused to receive the elder's messengers and actually put out of the church those who did receive them. And so the elder wrote this letter to a respected member of the church, Gaius, who had received his messengers and showed them hospitality, to encourage Gaius to continue being hospitable. And then the elder stated his plans to deal with Diotrephes on a subsequent visit. That's a very brief, sketchy, brief sketch of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. We're going to spend most of our time thinking about the closing book that is also associated, closing book of the New Testament, also associated with John, Revelation. Revelation belongs to a body of literature known as apocalyptic literature. The Greek word from which we get our word apocalypse, usually translated revelation, hence the title of the book, literally means, it comes from 2 Greek words, apokalypto, apo meaning from, kalypto meaning cover, hide, or conceal. So the word apocalypse means to uncover, to unhide, to unveil, to reveal, to take the cover away from. So apocalyptic literature flourished in Judaism between the 3rd century BC through the end of the New Testament period. And we have talked some about that when we talked about the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. The main non-canonical apocalypses of this period were the book of Enoch, the Assumption of Moses, the Secrets of Enoch, the book of Baruch, the book of 4th Ezra. If you want to kind of get a flavor of what some of the other extra biblical, non-canonical apocalyptic literature was like, you can find these books and read them, and you'll get a flavor of that. There are some apocalyptic sections, as we have seen when we surveyed the Old Testament, in the book of Daniel, Ezekiel, and Isaiah. The Hebrew canon, defined at the Council of Yamnia in AD 90, primarily by the Pharisees, who were consolidating Judaism after the destruction of the temple in AD 70, left out most of the apocalyptic literature of that time period. Did not include a lot of that kind of literature in the Hebrew canon. Apocalypticists believed that if they could just help the readers understand the end time, then they could somehow cope better with the present time. And so they were given these visions, these revelations of the end time, and presented them and offered them to help people understand the present in light of the end, which was believed to be close at hand. So apocalyptic literature is all about the end time, the images related to the end time. Characteristics of apocalyptic literature is that most of them were pseudonymous, which means they were attributed to famous people, but not necessarily written by those famous people. They were highly symbolic, and there's a whole stock or tradition, generally agreed upon apocalyptic symbols, such as beasts and eagles and so forth. Apocalyptic literature, whether we're talking about the literature in the 1st and 2nd centuries BC or the 1st century AD, all come from a time of persecution. And so they're designed not to scare people, but to give comfort to people who are faithful in times of persecution. And then, as you probably realize, there's a lot of numerology in apocalyptic literature. Numbers are symbolic and significant in general. And in the book of the Revelation, these generally significant numbers take on special significance. And there are all these numbers that I've listed here for you and in the study guide. 1, symbolizing unity. 2, stronger than 1. 3, sacred, divine, the number of the Trinity. 4, refers to world, nature, and boundaries, seasons, and directions. 5 is completeness, fingers and number of fingers and toes on each hand. 6 is incomplete or imperfect, falling short. 7 is divinely complete and perfect, and on and on. There are all these numbers that symbolize greater realities. And you have to kind of be aware of the numerology in order to make sense of the apocalyptic literature. Also, apocalyptic literature is very visionary, looking into the future. And in that sense, is predictive and dramatic, as we will see as we move through the book of Revelation. Now, as I said, clues within the book of Revelation seem to indicate that it was probably written during the persecution of the Roman Emperor Domitian, 81 to 96 AD, who proclaimed himself to be Lord and God. And Domitian actually required emperor worship throughout the empire, which probably consisted of offering incense to the emperor at a shrine and making the claim that Domitian, the Roman emperor, was Lord and God, and thus requiring that you worship the Roman emperor. It was basically a show of patriotism. It's basically a show of loyalty to the Roman Empire, certainly a step above pledging allegiance to a flag, but still basically a show of loyalty and patriotism. Christians, especially in Asia Minor, were required to do this. And if they did not do it, they would be called atheists, and they would suffer various forms of persecution, some even put to death. So, of course, Christians maintained that Jesus was Lord, not Domitian. In fact, by this time, this was identified as the non-negotiable creed of the Christian faith. Jesus Christ is Lord. Yet everything about this historical situation in which they found themselves seemed to suggest that Jesus was not Lord. To say that Jesus was Lord was to suggest that Jesus was in control, and yet with the Roman Empire oppressing them the way that it was doing, it led many of them to wonder what it even means to say Jesus is Lord when it appears that Jesus was not in control of the events of their lives. John himself was exiled and wrote this book as a pastoral letter to affirm that in spite of how things may seem at the time, God is still on the throne, not Domitian. The book seems to have been written either by John the Apostle or by someone highly influenced by John, writing in his name. It seems to come from the time of Domitian, near the end of the reign. From chapter 1, verse 9, we know that the author is exiled on the Isle of Patmos, which was a rocky and rugged island about 6 miles wide and 10 miles long, some 40 miles southwest of Ephesus in the Aegean Sea. We know from non-biblical sources that the island was used by Roman authorities as a place of exile. The way I look at the book of Revelation is that it is a highly symbolic drama that is played out in in 7 sections. Notice everything is in groups of 7. Just as we saw the Gospel of John was grouped around the 7 I am sayings of Jesus and the 7 signs of Jesus. So the book of Revelation is this 7-act play, and each of the 7 acts has 7 scenes to it. So Act 1 is about the 7 golden lampstands, and the lampstands represent the 7 churches, which were characteristic of, which were representative of the church at large. The first lampstand was the church in Ephesus, which had lost its first love. The second lampstand, the church in Smyrna, where the writer admonishes them to be faithful unto death. The third lampstand, Pergamum. The fourth lampstand, Thyatira. The fifth lampstand, Sardis. The sixth lampstand, Philadelphia. And the seventh lampstand, Laodicea, which was, the famous church that was neither cold nor hot, but was lukewarm. So the first act is really kind of surveying representative churches of the universal church. The second act was the 7 seals. It's a vision of heaven, actually. Chapter 4 in this section is centered with God the Father. Chapter 5 centered around Jesus the Son. And this section takes place in chapters 4 and 5. The third act was, still in the second act, sorry. The 7 seals are listed there for you in the study guide. There's the white horse, the red horse, the black horse, the pale green horse, the cry of the martyrs, the upheaval of the world, the sealing of the 144,000, and the gold incense container. All of these were the seals, the 7 seals, and it's the way that section unfolds. So you have the 7 lampstands, then you have the 7 seals. In Act 3, you have the 7 trumpets. The first trumpet, which represents the plague of hail and fire, the second trumpet, plague on the sea, and so forth, all the way through the 7th trumpet, which takes you through chapter 11, verse 18. The fourth act is the 7 pageants. And again, typical of John's style, John pulls out 7 significant signs, just as he had offered 7 signs in the Gospel of John. The first sign in chapter 12, the second in chapter 13, third, and so forth. And you can see the 7 pageants expressed in the 7 significant signs. The fifth act is the 7 bowls of wrath. And it describes curses on the earth and the sea and the rivers and the sun, even curse on the air. This describes the unleashing of God's judgment. The sixth act are the 7 actual judgments of Almighty God. And you can see that the final of the 7 judgments is when Satan was cast into the abyss. Satan is finally and forever banished and defeated. And then the book closes with the 7 great promises: a new heaven and a new earth, the millennium, the last judgment, the new Jerusalem, the measuring of the city. But it ends on this positive note, the 7 great promises of God. And so basically, as you see these scenes unfold in the book of the Revelation. It's basically taking you through the end of time when God judges the world and then redeems the world, and out of the world recreates a new kind of heaven and a new kind of earth. There are a lot of things that kind of come together at the end in the last book of the Revelation. Themes that were kind of introduced in Genesis are resolved in Revelation. The introduction of the serpent in Genesis. The serpent is never identified as Satan until the very end in the book of Revelation. We find out that that serpent in the garden was Satan. And a lot of the themes in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the new beginning, and in the book of Revelation, God creates a new heaven and a new earth. So there are a lot of the paradise that was lost in Genesis is restored in Revelation. There are a lot of things introduced in Genesis that are not resolved in a final way until the very end of the Bible in Revelation. Now, as you probably know, the book of Revelation has been interpreted in a variety of ways through the centuries. The first way of interpreting Revelation is the most popular way among a lot of people, and that's the futurist way. It's taken as a literal interpretation of chapters 4 through 22 as a blueprint of the last days of human history. The last 7 years represent the last of the 70 weeks in the book of Daniel. And there's all this effort to reconcile the images introduced in Daniel with the images introduced in Revelation. And in this method, the first 3 chapters are taken either as symbolic or as 7 eras of the church's history, or as applicable primarily to the date of writing. So in other words, the first 3 chapters dealing with the 7 churches either are considered to be symbolic of different kinds of churches, or are taken to be 7 stages of the church's history, or it's taken to be just applicable to those 7 churches in the first century, but not beyond. But basically, chapters 4 through 22 are seen as a blueprint for how the world is going to end. Another way of interpreting Revelation is the historical method, or sometimes it's called the historicist, or the continuous historical method. And this is a way of interpreting Revelation as a sketch of history from the time of Christ to the contemporary time. This method was popularized during the time of the Reformation by those who believed that the Catholic Church itself was the great Antichrist and the papacy was the beast. Not too many people hold to that view anymore, but it was made popular in the 16th century. A third method of interpretation is the idealist or philosophy of history method. This method views Revelation as a treatment of the forces, not the events, which are in conflict in the world. And so it's not, it treats the book of the Revelation not as a prediction of events, but as a description of the forces at work in the world. So this method sees John as trying to help people understand the powers which influence human choices and actions and destiny. The fourth is the preterist or contemporary historical view. The term preterist actually means one who or that which looks to or deals with the past. So this method insists that the visions of John grow out of and describe events in John's own day. It sees the content of Revelation as a symbolic treatment of things which existed in that day and God's purpose of dealing with the problem of human suffering, but it was all resolved in the first century. So these truths are equally and universally applicable in any time, place, or setting, but were primarily addressed to the situations in the first century. And then there are the millennial groups. And I think this is what we hear so much about in contemporary circles. Three other words are heard frequently in the interpretation of Revelation, and they refer to views of the meaning of the 1,000 years mentioned only in Revelation 20, verses 1 through 3. Let's take just a moment to look at those verses. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key of the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit, and shut it, and sealed it over him, that he should deceive the nations no more, till the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be loosed for a little while. So even though the word millennium itself is not used in the New Testament, there is this one section that I just read, only one section that talks about this 1,000 years. Well, out of that one reference to 1,000 years, there's this elaborate system that has been developed of interpreting that 1,000 years. So there are the amillennial interpreters who interpret that 1,000 years as just being symbolic of a long period of time without specific duration, not literally 1,000 years. So under this view, at any time Christ may return and bring an end to the entire redemption judgment process. Usually one who holds this view either falls into the historicist persuasion or the preterist persuasion. But basically the amillennialists are people who do not take the 1,000 years as being literal. Then there's the post-millennial interpretation of Revelation. And this view holds that the 1,000 years is probably a symbol of a long interval of peace and prosperity and joy, which will result from winning the world to the Christian faith. The period will endure until the return of Christ. And most of those who hold this view are historicists. And then there is, I think, probably the most famous of all of these, certainly the ones that get the most press in certain circles, are the Pre-Millennial Reviews. And this view holds that Christ will return personally, resurrect the dead who believe, imprison the prince of evil, Satan, and reign with his people in bliss and peace for a literal period of 1,000 years. And then after the release of Satan, there will be a final rebellion, which will be crushed, and then the evil dead will be raised and judged, and all will begin their eternal state. And this is usually the view of the futurists. As you can see, there's been a whole history of interpretation about Revelation, and a lot of these interpretations had to be revised when the predictions didn't come true. Jesus still has not returned. And but most people who look at the book of Revelation can agree on this, that the God who began history in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, the God who began this perfect paradise will see the world to its completion. The paradise that was lost in the beginning will be restored in the end. The God who created the heavens and the earth in the beginning will in the end create a new heaven and a new earth. And God is going to see to it that evil is defeated. Sin is once and for all defeated, represented by the Satan himself, and that Jesus will reign forever and ever as Lord and God. It's a beautiful, triumphant way for the scripture to end, resolving all of the tension, resolving all of the evil, ushering in this new age in which Jesus is Lord, that Jesus' lordship triumphs. It's the triumph of grace, the triumph of God. That in the end, the God who began the world will end the world on God's own terms and in God's own way. And the kingdoms of this world will become the kingdom of our Lord and his Christ, and he will reign forever and ever. A triumphant way to end this survey of Scripture. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the Bible. I hope to hear from you. Please let me hear from you if you have questions or just want to have some conversation around this biblical material. I hope I will hear from you soon.